She was no snob in the narrow sense of the word. She would have been very discontented if she had only the high-born on her visiting list. The high-born, of course, were safe. You could not make a mistake in having a duchess to tea, because in her own line a duchess had distinction. But it would not have been enough to have all the duchesses there were. It might even have been a disappointing tea party if the whole room was packed with them. What she wanted was the foam of the wave, the topmost, the most sunlit of the billows that rode the sea. Anything that had proved itself billowish was her game, and anything which showed signs of being a billow, even if it entailed a vegetarian lunch with cocktails, and the possible necessity of being painted like the artist's wife with an eyebrow in one corner of the picture and a substance like desiccated cauliflower in the center. That had always been her way, whatever those dear funny folk at Risholme had thought of, a juggler, a professor of yoga, a geologist, a psychoanalyst had been snapped up by her and exploited till he exploded. But Peppino was not as nimble as she. The incense at Sophie's had made him sneeze, and the primitive tunes on the spinet had made him snore. That had been all the uplift they had held for him. Thus, though she did not mind tiring herself to death, because Peppino was having such an interesting time, she didn't mind his going down to Risholme for the Sunday to rest, while she had a vegetarian lunch with post-cubists and a dinner with a princess. Literally, she could scarcely tell which of the two she looked forward to the most. The princess was safe, but the post-cubists might prove more perilously paying. It was impossible to make a corner in princesses, for they were too independent, but already, in case of post-cubism turning out to be the rage, she could visualize her music room, and even the famous Chippendale chairs being painted black, and the Sargent picture of Auntie being banished to the attic. She could not make them the rage, for she was not, as yet, the supreme arbiter here that she had been at Risholme. But should they become the rage, there was no one surely more capable than herself of giving the impression that she had discovered them. Lucia spent a strenuous afternoon with correspondence and telephonings, and dropped into Mrs. Sandeman's for a cup of tea, of which she stood sorely in need. She found there was no need to tell dearest Aggie about the party last night at Olga's, for the Evening Gazette had come in, and there was an account of it, described in Hermione's matchless style. Hermione had found the Bijon residence of the prima donna in Prompton Square full of friends, très intimes, who had been invited to celebrate the huge success of Lucrezia and to congratulate Mrs. Shuttleworth. There was Princess Isabel, wearing her wonderful turquoises, chatting with the composer, Signor Cortesi. Princess Isabel spoke Italian perfectly. And among other friends, Hermione had noticed the Duchess of Whitby, Lord Limpsfield, Mrs. Garraby Ashton, and Mrs. Philip Lucas. Chapter 5. The mystery of that Friday evening in the last week in June became portentous on the ensuing Saturday morning. A cab had certainly driven from the station to the Hurst late on Friday evening, but owing to the darkness it was not known who got out of it. Previously, the windows of the Hurst had been very diligently cleaned all Friday afternoon. Of course, the latter might be accounted for by the mere fact that they needed cleaning, but if it had been Peppino or Lucia herself who had arrived by the cab, if both of them, they would almost certainly have come by their motor. Surely some sign of their presence would have manifested itself either to Risholme's collective eye or to Risholme's ear. But the piano, Daisy felt certain, had not been heard, nor had the telephone tinkled for anybody. Also, when she looked out about 10:30 in the evening, and again when she went upstairs to bed, there were no lights in the house. But somebody had come, and as the servants' rooms looked out onto the back, it was probably a servant or servants. Daisy had felt so terribly interested in this that she came restlessly down and had a quarter of an hour's weeding to see if Abfu could tell her. She had been quite unable to form any satisfactory conjecture herself, and Abfu, after writing museum once or twice, had relapsed into rapid and unintelligible Arabic. She did not ring up Georgie to ask his help in solving this conundrum, because she hoped to solve it unaided and be able to tell him the answer. She went upstairs again, and after a little deep breathing and bathing her feet in alternate applications of hot and cold water in order to produce somnolence, found herself more widely awake than ever. Her well-trained mind cantered about on scents that led nowhere, and she was unable to find any that seemed likely to lead anywhere. Of Lucia, nothing whatever was known except what was accessible to anybody who spent a penny on the Evening Gazette. She had written to nobody. She had given no sign of any sort, and but for the Evening Gazette, she might, as far as Risholme was concerned, be dead. But the Evening Gazette showed that she was alive, painfully alive, in fact, if Hermione could be trusted. She had been seen here, there, and everywhere in London. Hermione had observed her chatting in the park with friends, sitting with friends in her box at the opera, shopping in Bond Street, watching polo, why she did not know a horse from a cow, at Hurlingham, and even in a punt at Henley. She had been entertaining in her own house, too. There had been dinner parties and musical parties, and she had dined at so many houses that Daisy had added them all up, hoping to prove that she had spent more evenings than there had been evenings to spend. But to her great regret, they came out exactly right. Now she was having her portrait painted by Sigismund, and not a word had she written, not a glimpse of herself had she vouchsafed to Risholme. Of course, Georgie had seen her when he went up to stay with Olga, but his account of her had been far from reassuring. She had said she did not care how tired she got while Peppino was enjoying London so tremendously. Why then, thought Daisy, with a sense of incredulous indignation, had Peppino come down a few Sundays ago, all by himself, and looking a perfect wreck? Very odd, I call it, muttered Daisy, turning over to her other side. It was odd, and Peppino had been odd. He had dined with Georgie one night, and on the other Georgie had dined with him, but he had said nothing about Lucia that Hermione had not trumpeted to the world. Otherwise, Peppino had not been seen at all on that Sunday, except when Mrs. Antrobus, not feeling very well in the middle of the Psalms on Sunday morning, had come out and observed him standing on tiptoe and peering into the window of the museum that looked onto the Roman antiquities. Mrs. Antrobus, feeling much better as soon as she got into the air, had come quite close up to him before he perceived her, and then, with only the curtest word of greeting, just as if she was the museum committee, he had walked away so fast that she could not but conclude that he wished to be alone. It was odd, too, and scarcely honorable, that he should have looked into the window like that, and clearly it was for that purpose that he had absented himself from church, thinking that he would be unobserved. Daisy had not the smallest doubt that he was spying for Lucia, and had been told merely to collect information and to say nothing, for though he knew that Georgie was on the committee, he had carefully kept off the subject of the museum on both their tete-a-tete dinners. Probably he had begun his spying the moment church began, and if Mrs. Antrobus had not so providentially felt faint, no one would have known anything about it. As it was quite likely that he had looked into every window by the time she saw him, and knew all that the museum contained. Since then, the museum had formally opened by Lady Ambermere, who had lent, not presented, some mittens which she said belonged to Queen Charlotte. It was impossible to prove that they hadn't, and the committee had put up some very baffling casement curtains, which would make an end to spying forever. Now, this degrading espionage had happened 3 weeks ago, come Sunday, and therefore, for 3 weeks, come Monday, Lucia must have known all about the museum. But not a word had she transmitted on that or any other subject. She had not demanded a place on the committee, nor presented the Elizabethan spit which so often made the chimney of her music room to smoke, nor written to say that they must arrange it all quite differently. That she had a plan, a policy about the museum, no one who knew Lucia could possibly doubt. But her policy, which thus at present was wrapped in mystery, might be her complete and eternal ignoring of it. It would indeed be dreadful if she intended to remain unaware of it. But Daisy doubted if anyone in her position and of her domineering character could be capable of such inhuman self-control. No, she meant to do something when she came back, but nobody could guess what it was or when she was coming. Daisy tossed and turned as she revolved these knotty points. She was sure Lucia would punish them all for making a museum while she was away, and not asking her advice and begging her to be president, and she would be ill with chagrin when she learned how successful it was proving. The tourist season, when Charabancs passed through his home in endless procession, had begun, and whole parties, after lunching at the Ambermere Arms, went to see it. In the first week alone, there had been 126 visitors, and that meant a corresponding take of shillings, without reckoning sixpenny catalogues. Even the committee paid their shillings when they went to look at their own exhibits, and there had been quite a scene when Lady Ambermere with a party from the hall tried to get in without paying for any of them on the ground that she had lent the museum Queen Charlotte's mittens. Georgie, who was hanging up another picture of his, had heard it all and hidden behind a curtain. The small boy in charge of the turnstile, bought from a bankrupt circus for a mere song, had, though trembling with fright, absolutely refused to let the turnstile turn until the requisite number of shillings had been paid, and didn't care whose mittens they were which Lady Ambermere had lent. And when, snatching up a catalogue without paying for it, she had threatened to report him to the committee, this intrepid lad had followed her, continuing to say, "Sixpence, please, my lady," till one of the party, in order to save brawling in a public place, had produced the insignificant sum. And if Lucia tried to get in without paying, on the ground that she and Peppino had given the stocks to the parish council, which had lent them to the museum, she would find her mistake. At length, in the effort to calculate what would be the total receipts of the year if 126 people per week paid their shillings, Daisy lapsed into an uneasy arithmetical slumber. Next morning, Saturday, the mystery of that arrival at the Hurst the evening before grew infinitely more intense. It was believed that only one person had come, and yet there was no doubt that several pounds of salmon, dozens, literally dozens, said Mrs. Boucher, for I saw the basket, of eggs, 2 chickens, a leg of lamb, as well as countless other provisions, unidentified, were delivered at the back door of the Hurst. A positive frieze of tradesmen's boys was strung across the green. Even if the mysterious arrival was Lucia herself, she could not, unless the whirl and worldliness of her London life had strangely increased her appetite, eat all that before Monday. And besides, why had she not rung up Georgie or somebody, or opened her bedroom window on this hot morning? Or could it be Peppino again, sent down here for a rest cure and a stuffing of his emaciated frame? But then he would not have come down without some sort of attendant to look after him. Risholme was completely baffled. Never had its powers of inductive reasoning been so nonplussed. For though so much went into the Hurst, nobody but the tradesmen's boys with empty baskets came out. Georgie and Daisy stared at each other in blankness over the garden paling, and when, in despair of arriving at any solution, they sought the oracles of Abfu, he would give them nothing but hesitating Arabic. "Which shows," said Daisy, as she put the planchette away in disgust, "that even he doesn't know, or doesn't wish to tell us." Lunchtime arrived, and there were very poor appetites in Risholme, with the exception of that gargantuan of whom nothing was known. But as for going to the Hurst and ringing the bell and asking if Mrs. Lucas was at home, all Risholme would sooner have died lingering and painful deaths rather than let Lucia know that they took the smallest interest in anything she had done, was doing, or would do. About 3 o'clock, Georgie was sitting on the green opposite his house, finishing his sketch, which the affairs of the museum had caused him sadly to neglect. He had got it upside down on his easel and was washing some more blue into the sky when he heard the hoot of a motor. He just looked up, and what he saw caused his hand to twitch so violently that he put a large dab of cobalt on the middle of his red brick house. For the motor had stopped at the Hurst, not 100 yards away, and out of it got Lucia and Peppino. She gave some orders to her chauffeur, and then, without noticing him, perhaps without seeing him, she followed Peppino into the house. Hardly waiting to wash the worst of the cobalt off his house, Georgie hurried into Daisy's and told her exactly what had happened. "No," said Daisy, and out they came again and stood in the shadow of her mulberry tree to see what would happen next. The mulberry tree had recovered from the pruning of its roots, so it wasn't it which Abfu had said was dead, and gave them good shelter. Nothing happened next. "But it's impossible," said Daisy, speaking in a sort of conspiratorial whisper. "It's queer enough her coming without telling any of us. But now she's here, she surely must ring somebody up." Georgie was thinking intently. "The next thing that will happen," he said, "will be that servants and luggage will arrive from the station. They'll be here any minute. I heard the 3:20 whistle just now. She and Peppino have driven down." "I shouldn't wonder," said Daisy. "But even now, what about the chickens and all those eggs? Georgie, it must have been her cook who came last night. She and Peppino were dining out in London and ordered all those provisions this morning. But there were enough to last them a week, and 3 pints of cream, so I've heard since, and enough ice for a skating rink. And it was then that Georgie had the flash of intuition that was forever memorable. It soared above inductive reasoning. "She's having a weekend party of some of her smart friends from London," he said slowly, "and she doesn't want any of us." Daisy blinked at this amazing light. Then she cast one withering glance in the direction of the Hurst. She said, "and her shingles, and her seed pearls, that's all." A minute afterwards the station cab arrived, pyramidal with luggage. 4 figures disembarked, 3 female and 1 male. "The major domo," said Daisy, and without another word marched back into her house to ask Abfu about it all. He came through at once and wrote "snob" all over the paper. There was no reason why Georgie should not finish his sketch, and he sat down again and began by taking out the rest of the misplaced cobalt. He felt so certain of the truth of his prophecy that he just let it alone to fulfill itself, and for the next hour he never worked with more absorbed attention. He knew that Daisy came out of her house, walking very fast, and he supposed she was on her way to spread the news and forecast the sequel. But beyond the fact that he was perfectly sure that a party from London was coming down for the weekend, he could form no idea of what would be the result of that. It might be that Lucia would ask him or Daisy, or some of her old friends to dine. But if she had intended to do that, she would probably have done it already. The only alternative seemed to be that she meant to ignore Risholm altogether. But shortly before the arrival of the fast train from London at 4:30, his prophetical calm began, for he was but human, to be violently agitated, and he took his tea in the window of his drawing-room, which commanded a good view of the front garden of the Hurst, and put his opera-glasses ready to hand. The window was a big bow, and he distinctly saw the end of Robert's brass telescope projecting from the corresponding window next door. Once more a motor horn sounded, and the Lucases' car drew up at the gate of the Hurst. There stepped out Mrs. Garraby Ashton, followed by the weird bright thing which had called to take Lucia to the private view of the post-cubists. Georgie had not time for the moment to rack his brain as to the name he had forgotten, for observation was his primary concern, and next he saw Lord Limpsfield, whom he had met at Olga's party. Finally there emerged a tall, slim, middle-aged man in Oxford trousers, for whom Georgie instantly conceived a deep distrust. He had thick auburn hair, for he wore no hat, and he waved his hands about in a silly manner as he talked. Over his shoulder was a little cape. Then Lucia came tripping out of the house with her short skirts and her shingles, and they all chattered together, and kissed and squealed, and pointed in different directions, and moved up the garden into the house. The door was shut, and the end of Robert's brass telescope withdrawn. Hardly had these shameful events occurred when Georgie's telephone bell rang. It might be Daisy wanting to compare notes, but it might be Lucia asking him to tea. He felt torn in half at the idea. Carnal curiosity urged him with clamor to go. Dignity dissuaded him. Still halting between two opinions, he went towards the instrument, which continued ringing. He felt sure now that it was Lucia, and what on earth was he to say? He stood there so long that Foljam came hurrying into the room in case he had gone out. "See who it is, Foljam," he said. Foljam, with amazing calm, took off the receiver. "Trunk call," she said. He glued himself to the instrument, and soon there came a voice he knew. "No, is it you?" he asked. "What is it?" "I'm motoring down tomorrow morning," said Olga, "and Princess Isabel is probably coming with me, though she is not absolutely certain. But expect her, unless I telephone tomorrow. Be a darling and give us lunch, as we shall be late. And come and dine. Terrible hurry. Goodbye." "No, you must wait a minute," screamed Georgie. "Of course I'll do that. But I must tell you, Lucia's just come with a party from London and hasn't asked any of us." "No," said Olga. "Then don't tell her I'm coming. She's become such a bore. She asks me to lunch and dinner every day." "How thrilling, though, Georgie. Whom has she got?" Suddenly the name of the weird bright female came back to Georgie. "Mrs. Ellingsby," he said. "Lor," said Olga. "Who else?" "Mrs. Garraby Ashton." "What?" "Garraby Ashton," said Georgie very distinctly. "And Lord Limpsfield, and a tall man in Oxford trousers with auburn hair." "It sounds like your double, Georgie," said Olga. "And a little cape like yours?" "Yes," said Georgie rather coldly. "I think it must be Stephen Merriall," said Olga after a pause. "And who's that?" asked he. "Lucia's lover," said Olga, quite distinctly. "No," said Georgie. "Of course he isn't. I only meant he was always there. But I believe he's Hermione. I'm not sure, but I think so, Georgie. We shall have a hectic Sunday. Goodbye. Tomorrow about 2 or 3 for lunch, and 2 or 3 for lunch. What a gossip you are." He heard that delicious laugh and the click of her receiver. Georgie was far too thrilled to gasp. He sat quite quiet, breathing gently. For the honor of Risholm, he was glad that a princess was perhaps coming to lunch with him. But apart from that, he would really have much preferred that Olga should be alone. The affaire Lucia was so much more thrilling than anything else, but Princess Isabel might feel no interest in it, and instead they would talk about all sorts of dull things like kings and courts. Then suddenly he sprang from his chair. There was a leg of lamb for Sunday lunch, and an apple tart, and nothing else at all. What was to be done? The shops by now would be shut. He rang for Foljam. Miss Olga's coming to lunch, and possibly a friend of hers, he said. What are we to do? A leg of lamb and an apple tart's good enough for anybody, isn't it? Said Foljam severely. This really seemed true as soon as it was pointed out, and Georgie made an effort to dismiss the matter from his mind. But he could not stop still. It was all so exciting. And after having changed his Oxford trousers in order to minimize the likeness between him and that odious Mr. Mariol, he went out for a constitutional, round the green from all points of which he could see any important development at the Hurst. Risholme generally was doing the same, and his stroll was interrupted by many agreeable stoppages. It was already known that Lucia and Peppino had arrived, and that servants and luggage had come by the 3:20, and that Lucia's motor had met the 4:30 and returned laden with exciting people. Georgie therefore was in high demand, for he might supply the names of the exciting people, and he had the further information to divulge that Olga was arriving tomorrow, and was lunching with him and dining at her own house. He said nothing about a possible princess. She might not come, and in that case he knew that there would be a faint suspicion in everybody's mind that he had invented it, whereas if she did, she would no doubt sign his visitor's book for everyone to see. Feeling ran stormy high against Lucia, and as usual, when Risholme felt the thing deeply, there was little said by way of public comment, though couples might have been observed with set and angry faces and gabbling mouths. But higher yet ran curiosity, and surmise as to what Lucia would do and what Olga would do. Not a sign had come for anyone from the Hurst. Not a soul had been asked to lunch, dinner, or even tea, and if Lucia seemed to be ashamed of Risholme's society before her grand friends, there was no doubt that Risholme's society was ashamed of Lucia. And then suddenly a deadly hush fell on these discussions, and even those who were walking fastest in their indignation came to a halt. For out of the front door of the Hurst streamed the exciting people and their hosts. There was Lucia, hatless and shingled and short-skirted, and the bird of paradise, and Mrs. Garraby Ashton and Peppino, and Lord Limpsfield and Mr. Mariol, all talking shrilly together, with shrieks of hollow laughter. They came slowly across the green towards the little pond round which Risholme stood, and passed within 50 yards of it. And if Lucia had been the Gorgon, Risholme could not more effectually have been turned into stone. She, too, appeared not to notice them, so absorbed was she in conversation, and on they went, straight towards the museum. Just as they passed Colonel Boucher's house, Mrs. Boucher came out in her bath chair, and without pause was wheeled straight through the middle of them. She then drew up by the side of the green below the large elm. The party passed into the museum. The windows were open, and from inside them came shrieks of laughter. This continued for about 10 minutes, and then they all came out again. Several of them carried catalogues, and Mr. Mariol was reading one of them in a loud voice. "Pair of worsted mittens," he announced, "belonging to Queen Charlotte, and presented by the Lady Ambermere." "Don't," said Lucia. "Don't make fun of our dear little museum, Stephen." As they retraced their way along the edge of the green, movement came back to Risholme again. Lucia's policy with regard to the museum had declared itself. Georgie strolled up to Mrs. Boucher's bath chair. Mrs. Boucher was extremely red in the face, and her hands were trembling. "Good evening, Mr. Georgie," said she. "Another party of strangers, I see, visiting the museum. They looked very odd people, and I hope we shan't find anything missing. Any news?" That was a very dignified way of taking it, and Georgie responded in the same spirit. "Not a scrap that I know of," he said, "except that Olga's coming down tomorrow." "That will be nice," said Mrs. Boucher. "Risholme is always glad to see her." Daisy joined them. "Good evening, Mrs. Quantock," said Mrs. Boucher. "Any news?" "Yes, indeed," said Daisy, rather breathlessly. "Didn't you see them? Lucia and her party?" "No," said Mrs. Boucher firmly. "She is in London, surely. Anything else?" Daisy took the cue. Complete ignorance that Lucia was in Risholme at all was a noble maneuver. "It must have been my mistake," she said. "Oh, my mulberry tree has quite come round." "No," said Mrs. Boucher in the Risholme voice. "I am pleased. I dare say the pruning did it good. And Mr. Georgie's just told me that our dear Olga, or should I say Mrs. Shuttleworth, is coming down tomorrow. But he hasn't told me what time yet." "2 or 3, she said," answered Georgie. "She's motoring down, and is going to have lunch with me whenever she gets here." "Indeed? Then I should advise you to have something cold that won't spoil by waiting. A bit of cold lamb, for instance. Nothing so good on a hot day." "What an excellent idea," said Georgie. "I was thinking of hot lamb, but the other's much better. I'll have it cooked tonight." "And a nice tomato salad," said Mrs. Boucher. "And if you haven't got any, I can give you some. Send your fall jam round, and she'll come back with 6 ripe tomatoes." Georgie hurried off to see to these new arrangements, and Colonel Boucher having strolled away with Piggy, his wife could talk freely to Mrs. Quantock. She did. Lucia, waking rather early next morning, found she had rather an uneasy conscience as her bedfellow, and she used what seemed very reasonable arguments to quiet it. There would have been no point in writing to Georgie or any of them to say that she was bringing down some friends for the week-end and would be occupied with them all Sunday. She could not, with all these guests, play duets with Georgie, or get poor Daisy to give an exhibition of Ouija, or have Mrs. Boucher in her bath chair to tea, for she would give them all long histories of purely local interest, which could not conceivably amuse people like Lord Limpsfield or Weird Sophie. She had been quite wise to keep Risholme and Brompton Square apart, for they would not mix. Besides, her guests would go away on Monday morning, and she had determined to stop over till Tuesday, and be extremely kind and not the least condescending. She would have 1 or 2 of them to lunch, and 1 or 2 more to dinner, and give Georgie a full hour of duets as well. Naturally, if Olga had been here, she would have asked Olga on Sunday, but Olga had been singing last night at the opera. Lucia had talked a good deal about her at dinner, and given the impression that they were never out of each other's houses, either in town or here, and had lamented her absence.